My name is Lucy Parker. I'm 32 years old, and I'll never forget the exact moment my mother told her best friend, Karen, that I'd never amount to anything. I was standing just outside the kitchen door, frozen in place, holding a basket of laundry I was about to bring upstairs. Her words hit me like a physical blow, sharp, cold, and so casually cruel that for a second, I thought I'd misheard her. But no, she said it again, laughing as if my entire existence was some kind of joke she was sharing over coffee. The worst part? Karen didn't even disagree. She just nodded, sipped her tea, and said something about how some people are just meant to stay small. If you've ever been completely blindsided by someone who was supposed to believe in you, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I didn't storm into that kitchen. I didn't scream or cry or demand an explanation. Instead, I stood there in the hallway, my hands trembling so badly I nearly dropped the basket, and I made a silent promise to myself that would change everything. My mother didn't know I'd heard her, and honestly, I didn't want her to know. Not yet. Because what she'd just done was hand me the most powerful weapon I'd ever had. Pure, unfiltered motivation wrapped in humiliation. That moment became the invisible fire that would burn inside me for years. The kind of fire that doesn't explode outward, but instead forges something unbreakable deep within. If this story is hitting close to home, hit that subscribe button and drop a like. You're going to want to see how this unfolds. I walked upstairs that day, put the laundry away, and stared at myself in the mirror for what felt like hours. My reflection looked the same tired eyes, same self-doubt written across my face, same girl who'd spent her whole life trying to win approval from a woman who clearly had none to give. But something inside me had shifted, like a door slamming shut on one version of myself and cracking open to reveal someone I didn't yet know. I didn't have a plan, I didn't have money, and I sure as hell didn't have confidence. What I had was a burning question that wouldn't leave me alone. What if I proved her wrong? What if I became everything she said I couldn't be? Not to hurt her, but to finally be free of needing her validation. Little did I know, that question would lead me to a $2 million penthouse and a life I never imagined possible. Before that day in the hallway, I'd spent most of my 20s drifting through life like I was waiting for permission to actually start living. I worked dead-end retail jobs that paid barely enough to cover rent, dated guys who treated me like an option rather than a priority, and worst of all, I constantly looked to my mother for some sign that I was doing okay. Every decision I made, what to wear, what career path to consider, even what friends to keep, was filtered through this desperate need for her approval. It's embarrassing to admit now, but I genuinely believed that if I could just make her proud, everything else would fall into place. The problem was, nothing I did ever seemed good enough, and her criticisms always felt like they cut deeper than anyone else's. Growing up, my mom had this way of disguising cruelty as concern. She'd say things like, "I'm only telling you this because I love you, but you're not smart enough for college." Or, "Honey, some people are leaders and some are followers. You've always been a follower." At family dinners, she'd compare me to my cousin Jennifer, who had a stable accounting job and a perfect fiancé, as if Jennifer's life was the measuring stick for success and I was falling miles short. I started to internalize every word, believing that maybe she was right. Maybe I was destined to be mediocre, forgettable, someone who'd never make waves or leave a mark. That kind of psychological damage doesn't happen overnight. It's death by 1,000 paper cuts, each comment slicing away another piece of your self-worth until you're not even sure who you are anymore. But here's what I've learned about people who tear others down. They're usually projecting their own fears and failures onto you. My mother never finished college, never pursued the dreams she'd once had, and spent her life settling for a marriage that made her miserable and a job she hated. Instead of dealing with her own disappointments, she decided to make sure I stayed small enough that I'd never remind her of everything she didn't become. Understanding that now doesn't erase the pain of those years, but it does put it in perspective. If you've ever felt crushed by someone else's words, especially from family, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It's not just hurtful, it's suffocating, like you're carrying around this invisible weight that no one else can, but that affects everything you do. The day I overheard that conversation wasn't planned, it was one of those random moments that changes everything. I'd been living in a tiny studio apartment across town, barely scraping by, but I'd driven over to my childhood home that Saturday morning to help my mom with some yard work she'd been complaining about. I thought I was being a good daughter, showing up with work gloves and a willing attitude, trying once again to earn some acknowledgement or appreciation. Karen's car was in the driveway when I arrived, which wasn't unusual since she and my mom had been friends for decades, and I figured I'd just say a quick hello before getting started outside. But as I walked through the front door, I heard my name float through the air from the kitchen, and something in my gut told me to stop and listen. "Lucy?" my mom said with this dismissive laugh that I recognized immediately. Okay, that girl will never amount to anything, I'm telling you. She's 28 years old and still working at that clothing store. No real direction, no ambition. I don't know where I went wrong with her, but at this point, I've accepted she's just going to be ordinary. The word ordinary dripped with such contempt that it felt like acid. Karen made some sympathetic sound, and then my mother continued. Her brother has his law degree. Her cousin Jennifer just got promoted to senior accountant, and Lucy? Lucy can barely pay her bills. Honestly, I've stopped expecting anything from her. It's easier that way. Before I continue, make sure you're subscribed because what happens next is absolutely insane. And leave a like if you're as shocked as I was. I stood there in that hallway, my entire body going cold despite the warm morning sun streaming through the windows. It wasn't just the words themselves, it was the casual certainty with which she said them. Like my failure was such an established fact that it didn't even warrant disappointment anymore. My hands started shaking, my vision blurred, and I felt this strange disconnect, like I was watching myself from outside my body. Part of me wanted to burst into that kitchen and scream at her, demand to know how a mother could say something so cruel about her own child. But the other part of me, the part that had been trained for years to shrink and apologize and never make waves, told me to stay silent, to pretend I hadn't heard anything, to protect her from the consequences of her own cruelty. That's the most messed up part. Even in that moment of total betrayal, my first instinct was to protect her feelings instead of my own. I quietly set down the laundry basket, turned around, and walked straight out of that house without saying a word. My legs felt like they were moving on autopilot as I got back in my car, started the engine, and drove aimlessly through the suburbs for over an hour, tears streaming down my face the entire time. I kept replaying her words in my head, dissecting every syllable, wondering if maybe I'd misunderstood or taken it out of context, but there was no other way to interpret what I'd heard. My own mother had given up on me, had written me off as a disappointment, and had felt comfortable enough to announce it to her friend like it was just another piece of gossip. The betrayal cut deeper than anything I'd experienced before because it confirmed every terrible thing I'd secretly believed about myself, that I wasn't good enough, that I'd never be successful, that I was destined to disappoint everyone around me. The worst part wasn't even the initial shock. It was how that conversation poisoned every memory I had. Suddenly, every half-hearted, "That's nice, honey," when I'd shared something I was proud of made sense. Every time she'd changed the subject when relatives asked about my life, every time she'd emphasized my siblings' achievements while barely mentioning mine, every time she'd suggested I was still figuring things out with that patronizing tone, it all clicked into place like pieces of a horrible puzzle I hadn't realized I was building. She'd been thinking this about me for years, maybe my entire adult life, and I'd been completely oblivious, desperately trying to earn love and respect from someone who'd already decided I wasn't worth it. That realization didn't just hurt. It fundamentally changed how I saw my entire past, coloring every interaction with this new, devastating context. For weeks after that day, I moved through life in a fog of depression and self-doubt. I'd go to work at the clothing store, paste on a fake smile for customers, and then go home to my cramped studio apartment and cry until I fell asleep. I stopped answering my mom's calls, not because I was ready to confront her, but because I genuinely didn't know what to say or how to act around her anymore. How do you have a normal conversation with someone who thinks you're a failure but doesn't know you know? Friends noticed something was off, but I couldn't bring myself to tell them the truth because saying it out loud would make it feel more real. The weight of carrying that secret was crushing, like I was walking around with this invisible wound that no one could see but that affected absolutely everything. My confidence, my decisions, even my posture somehow felt more defeated, as if my body was physically manifesting the pain my heart was feeling. About a month after overhearing that conversation, something inside me shifted from devastation to determination. I was lying in bed one Sunday morning, staring at the ceiling of my depressing studio apartment, when I realized I had two choices. I could let my mother's words define me forever, or I could use them as fuel to become someone she never imagined I could be. The anger I'd been suppressing started transforming into something more productive, a cold, calculated resolve that felt almost liberating. I decided right then that I wouldn't confront her, wouldn't give her the satisfaction of knowing her words had cut so deep, and wouldn't waste energy trying to change her mind. Instead, I'd prove her wrong so completely, so undeniably, that no explanation would ever be necessary. There's something incredibly powerful about silent revenge, the kind where you don't announce your intentions or give anyone a chance to discourage you. I made a promise to myself that morning. I would build a life so successful, so impressive, that one day my mother would see what I'd become and realize how catastrophically wrong she'd been about me. But here's the key. I wasn't doing it for her approval anymore. I was doing it in spite of her doubt. That distinction mattered because it meant my success wouldn't depend on her validation. For the first time in my life, I was setting goals based on what I wanted, not what would finally make her proud. It felt like breaking chains I didn't even know I'd been wearing, like discovering I could breathe deeper than I ever had before. I didn't tell anyone about my plan because I knew that announcing big changes invites skepticism and unsolicited advice that can kill motivation before it even builds momentum. My coworkers at the store had no idea I was spending every lunch break researching online courses and business strategies. My friends didn't know I'd stopped going out on weekends to save money and study instead. Even my brother, who I was relatively close to, had no clue that I was quietly plotting a complete life transformation. There's a certain strength in silence, in working on yourself when no one's watching, in building something substantial before the world gets a chance to judge it. I was tired of being underestimated, tired of being pitied, and tired of living small. What I didn't know yet was that this decision, this choice to channel humiliation into ambition, would completely change the trajectory of my entire life. The first thing I did was get brutally honest with myself about my current situation, and let me tell you, that reality check was painful. I was 28 years old, making $32,000 a year at a retail job with no benefit, living paycheck to paycheck in a 400 square foot apartment, and I had exactly $1,200 in savings. On paper, my mother was right. I wasn't exactly setting the world on fire, but instead of letting those facts defeat me, I used them as a baseline, a before picture that would eventually make the after that much more dramatic. I bought a cheap notebook and started writing down specific, measurable goals. Save $10,000 in 1 year, learn a high-income skill, start a side business, and eventually quit retail forever. These weren't vague dreams. They were concrete targets with deadlines and action steps. I decided to focus on digital marketing because I'd always been decent with social media, and I'd noticed that businesses were desperately looking for people who understood online advertising. I enrolled in 3 different online courses, spending money I really couldn't afford to spend, but I viewed it as an investment in myself that no one could ever take away. Every morning before my retail shift, I'd wake up at 5:30 a.m. and study for 2 hours, learning about SEO, social media algorithms, email marketing, and content strategy. My coworkers thought I was crazy for being so tired all the time, but I didn't care. While they were scrolling through Instagram mindlessly, I was learning how to make Instagram work for business. If you've ever had to rebuild yourself from scratch, hit that subscribe button because you're going to love where this journey goes. And drop a like if you believe in the power of silent determination. After 3 months of intensive learning, I started reaching out to small local businesses, offering to manage their social media for dirt cheap just to build my portfolio and get real experience. My first client was a family-owned bakery that paid me $300 a month to handle their Facebook and Instagram. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Then I got a coffee shop, then a boutique fitness studio, and within 6 months, I was making an extra $1,500 a month on the side while still working my retail job. I was exhausted, running on maybe 5 hours of sleep a night, but I was also more alive than I'd felt in years. Every small win, every new client, every successful campaign, every dollar I added to my savings account felt like a tiny act of rebellion against my mother's verdict. I wasn't just building a business, I was building evidence that she'd been wrong about me, one client at a time. Exactly 13 months after overhearing that conversation, I hit my first major milestone, $10,000 in savings. I remember the exact moment I checked my bank account and saw that number staring back at me. I was sitting in my car during my lunch break at the clothing store, eating a sad sandwich I'd packed from home, and I literally started crying right there in the parking lot. Not sad tears this time, but this overwhelming mix of pride, relief, and vindication that I'd actually done something I said I would do. For someone who'd spent years doubting herself and being doubted by others, proving I could set a goal and achieve it felt like discovering I had superpowers I never knew existed. The best part? Nobody knew. My mother had no idea her disappointing daughter had just accomplished something significant through sheer discipline and sacrifice. That $10,000 represented so much more than just money in a bank account. It was proof that I could delay gratification, make smart decisions, and execute a plan without anyone cheering me on or holding me accountable. I'd saved it by cutting every possible expense. I stopped eating out completely, canceled subscriptions I didn't need, sold clothes and furniture I could live without, and picked up extra shifts whenever possible. My social life suffered because I said no to expensive dinners and weekend trips, and I'm sure some friends thought I was being cheap or antisocial, but I didn't care what anyone thought because I had a vision they couldn't see yet. While my former college roommates were posting Instagram stories from beach vacations they'd put on credit cards, I was quietly building a foundation for actual wealth, not just the appearance of it. What made this victory even sweeter was the privacy of it. I didn't announce it on social media, didn't tell my family, didn't even tell my closest friends. This success was mine and mine alone, a secret achievement that I could hold close and draw strength from whenever I doubted myself. There's something deeply satisfying about silence, about knowing you're capable of more than people assume, about carrying proof of your growth that no one can. My mother still thought I was struggling at that retail job, probably still telling her friends I'd never amount to anything. And that disconnect between her perception and my reality became a source of quiet power. I was building a completely different life right under everyone's, and the gap between who they thought I was and who I was becoming grew wider every single day. But let me be real with you. This journey wasn't some smooth, inspirational montage where everything magically worked out. There were plenty of moments when I wanted to quit, when the exhaustion felt unbearable, when I questioned whether any of this was even worth it. About 18 months into my transformation, I lost 3 clients in the same week because they couldn't afford my services anymore, and my side income dropped by 40% overnight. I remember sitting on my bathroom floor at 2 a.m., having a full-blown panic attack, wondering if I was delusional for thinking I could build something substantial. The voice in my head that sounded suspiciously like my mother kept saying, "See? You're not cut out for this. You should just accept that you're ordinary and stop trying so hard." Those moments of doubt were brutal because they felt like evidence that maybe she'd been right all along. I also dealt with imposter syndrome that hit me like waves at the most inconvenient times. I'd be in a meeting with a potential client, pitching my services, and suddenly I'd hear this internal voice screaming, "Who do you think you are? You're just a retail worker pretending to be a marketing expert. They're going to see right through you." I'd land a great client, and instead of celebrating, I'd convince myself it was luck, or that I'd somehow tricked them into hiring me. There were nights when I'd lie awake, running through every failure and setback, using them as evidence in a mental trial, where I was both the defendant and the prosecutor. The worst part was that I couldn't talk to anyone about these fears because I'd kept my entire journey so private. I was fighting these battles completely alone, with no support system to remind me how far I'd come. Financial stress was another constant companion during those. Even though I was making progress, there were months when an unexpected car repair or medical bill would wipe out weeks of savings, and I'd feel like I was running on a treadmill, working my ass off but staying in the same place. I remember one particularly low point when my laptop, the tool I needed for all my freelance work, completely died, and I didn't have enough money to replace it immediately. I had to put it on a credit card, which felt like a massive failure after I'd worked so hard to stay out of debt. But here's what I learned during those dark moments. Obstacles don't mean you're on the wrong path. They're just part of any worthwhile journey. Every successful person I researched had faced setbacks, rejections, and moments of crippling self-doubt. The difference wasn't that they avoided failure. It was that they didn't let failure become their identity. So I picked myself up, adjusted my strategy, and kept moving forward, even when forward felt like the hardest direction to go. Around the 2-year mark, I made a decision that seemed risky, but turned out to be the turning point in my entire journey. I quit my retail job and went all in on my digital marketing business. My manager at the store thought I was making a huge mistake. My dad called me to express his concerns about losing stable income. And honestly, part of me wondered if I was being reckless. But I'd reached a point where I was turning down clients because I didn't have enough hours in the day. And I knew that if I wanted to scale beyond just scraping by, I needed to fully commit. So on a random Tuesday morning, I gave my 2 weeks notice, and for the first time in my adult life, I bet entirely on myself. The fear was paralyzing, but the excitement was even stronger. Without the constraints of a retail schedule, I could finally take on bigger clients and more complex projects. I started targeting mid-sized companies instead of just small local business, and I raised my rates significantly because I'd learned that charging too little actually makes potential clients question your value. One of my first major clients was a regional gym chain that needed a complete social media overhaul. They paid me $5,000 a month, which was more than I'd been making at my retail job. That contract gave me the breathing room to hire a virtual assistant, invest in better tools and software, and actually start building a real agency instead of just being a freelancer. Make sure you're subscribed because what happens next changes everything. And hit that like button if you've ever taken a massive leap of faith that terrified you. But here's where strategy became crucial. I didn't just work harder, I worked smarter. I started studying business owners who'd built 7-figure agencies and noticed they all had systems, processes, and ways of delivering results that could be replicated and scaled. So I developed templates, automated workflows, and standardized packages that allowed me to serve more clients without proportionally increasing my workload. I also started creating content myself, writing blog posts, making YouTube videos about marketing strategies, building an email list, which positioned me as an expert and brought in clients who were already sold on my value before our first conversation. Within a year of going full-time, I was making $15,000 a month consistently, and I'd moved from that depressing studio into a decent two-bedroom apartment. My mother still had no idea about any of this because I'd strategically kept my distance, only showing up for major holidays and keeping conversations surface level. 3 years after that devastating conversation in my mother's kitchen, I bought my first luxury item, a brand new Mercedes C-Class. I'd always driven beat-up used cars that constantly needed repairs, and I told myself that one day, when I made it, I'd get something nice. When I walked into that dealership and paid a substantial down payment in cash, then drove off the lot in a car that smelled like leather and possibility, I felt like I'd crossed some invisible threshold into a different category of person. It wasn't about showing off. I genuinely didn't post about it on social media or tell most people. It was about proving to myself that I could have nice things, that I deserved them, that my mother's prediction about my life had been completely and utterly wrong. The feeling of sitting in that driver's seat for the first time was almost spiritual. I remember gripping the steering wheel, looking at myself in the rearview mirror, and thinking about the girl who'd stood frozen in that hallway 3 years earlier, devastated and defeated. That girl wouldn't recognize who I'd become, not because of the car itself, but because of what it represented: discipline, vision, and the willingness to bet on myself when no one else would. I drove around aimlessly for hours that first day, windows down, music loud, feeling this overwhelming sense of freedom and vindication. Every mile felt like I was putting more distance between my old life and the new one I was building, like I was literally driving away from the person my mother thought I'd always be. What made this purchase even more meaningful was that I'd paid for it with money I'd earned entirely on my own, through skills I'd taught myself, serving clients I'd attracted through my own effort. This wasn't a gift, wasn't an inheritance, wasn't luck. It was the direct result of hundreds of early mornings, thousands of hours of learning and working, and an unshakable commitment to proving that I was capable of more than anyone believed. I parked that Mercedes in my apartment complex, walked upstairs, poured myself a glass of wine, and toasted to the most important person in my journey, myself. Because at the end of the day, this transformation wasn't about revenge or proving anything to my mother. It was about reclaiming my own sense of worth and building a life that I was genuinely proud of, regardless of anyone else's opinion. Last week, at 32 years old, exactly 4 years after overhearing my mother's cruel assessment of my life, I closed on a $2 million penthouse in the heart of downtown. Let me paint you a picture of what that moment felt like. I was sitting in a sleek conference room with my real estate agent, my lawyer, and the sellers, signing document after document. And with each signature, I felt like I was writing a new ending to a story that was supposed to have turned out completely different. This wasn't just a real estate transaction. It was the final, undeniable proof that everything my mother believed about me had been spectacularly, devastatingly wrong. The penthouse has floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, a gourmet kitchen I barely know how to use yet, and a master suite bigger than my first 3 apartments combined. Getting to this point required sacrifices most people can't even imagine. While my agency was generating serious revenue, I'd scaled to a team of 8, and we were bringing in consistent 6 figures monthly. I lived well below my means for years, reinvesting profits back into the business and funneling every extra dollar into investments and saving. I worked with a financial advisor who helped me diversify into real estate investments, index funds, and other assets that grew my wealth beyond just my business income. I studied wealthy people obsessively, reading books about their habits and strategies, learning that real wealth isn't about what you spend, but what you build and keep. So when I finally decided it was time to upgrade my living situation, I didn't just have enough for a down payment. I could afford to put down 40% in cash and still have substantial reserves. The day I got the keys, I walked through that empty penthouse alone, my footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors, and I cried harder than I'd cried in years. But these weren't tears of sadness or pain. They were tears of absolute triumph, of disbelief that this was actually my life, of gratitude for the girl who'd refused to accept her mother's verdict as truth. I stood at those massive windows, looking out over a city that used to intimidate me, and I thought about every single moment of doubt, every failure, every time I wanted to quit but didn't. This penthouse wasn't just a home. It was a monument to resilience, a physical manifestation of what happens when you channel humiliation into determination and refuse to let someone else's limited vision define your potential. The walls I was standing between represented every wall I'd broken through to get here. I didn't tell my mother about the penthouse immediately. I let her find out the way I'd found out about her real opinion of accidentally and devastatingly. About 2 weeks after I moved in, my brother Nathan came over to see the place, and he was absolutely blown away. He kept walking from room to room saying things like, "Lucy, what the hell? How did you afford this?" And "This is insane. I had no idea you were doing this well." I gave him the abbreviated version of my journey, swore him to secrecy because I wasn't ready to deal with family drama yet, and thought that would be the end of it. But Nathan, bless his heart, is terrible at keeping secrets, and within 3 days, he'd mentioned something to our dad, who mentioned it to our mom, and suddenly my phone was blowing up. My mother called me 7 times in one afternoon before I finally answered. Her voice had this strange quality I'd never heard before, somewhere between shock, disbelief, and something that almost sounded like panic. "Lucy, Nathan said you bought a penthouse downtown? That can't be right. Did you marry someone wealthy? Did you win the lottery? What's going on?" The questions came rapid fire, each one revealing her complete inability to reconcile the daughter she'd written off with the reality of what I'd accomplished. I stayed calm, kept my voice steady, and simply said, "I built a successful digital marketing agency over the past 4 years. The penthouse is mine. I bought it with money I earned." The silence on the other end of the line was so long, I thought the call had dropped. When she finally spoke again, her tone had shifted to something defensive and slightly accusatory. "Why didn't you tell us? Why did we have to hear about this from Nathan? I'm your mother, Lucy." And there it was, the audacity to be upset that I hadn't shared my success with her, as if she'd been supportive and encouraging all along. I wanted to scream at her, to bring up that conversation from 4 years ago, to ask her if she remembered telling Karen I'd never amount to anything. But I didn't. Instead, I said something that I'd been rehearsing in my head for years. "Mom, I didn't tell you because I didn't need your approval or validation anymore. I built this life for myself, by myself, and I'm proud of what I've accomplished, regardless of what you or anyone else thinks about it." The power in that moment wasn't in her apology. She didn't offer one, but in my complete indifference to whether she was proud of me or not. Her opinion simply didn't matter anymore, and that realization was more liberating than any penthouse could ever be. Looking back on these 4 years, I realized that overhearing my mother's conversation was both the worst and best thing that ever happened to me. It shattered my illusions about unconditional parental support and forced me to confront some brutal truths about how I'd been living, passively, seeking external validation, waiting for permission to pursue something meaningful. But it also gave me something invaluable, clarity about who I was relying on for my sense of worth and a burning motivation to rewrite the narrative of my life. Without that devastating moment, I might have spent decades continuing to shrink myself, working dead-end jobs, and wondering why I always felt so unfulfilled. The pain of that betrayal became the catalyst for the most profound personal transformation I could have ever imagined. The journey taught me that other people's opinions, even from those closest to you, are often projections of their own limitations rather than accurate assessments of your potential. My mother couldn't see me succeeding because she'd never seen herself succeed, and she'd confused her own self-imposed ceiling with some universal truth about our family's capabilities. Once I understood that her doubt wasn't really about me at all, it lost its power over me. I stopped trying to prove anything to her specifically and started building a life that excited me, that challenged me, that made me proud when I looked in the mirror. The shift from seeking external validation to cultivating internal confidence was gradual and difficult, but it was absolutely essential to everything I accomplished. I won't pretend that success solved all my problems or healed all my wounds. Therapy has been a crucial part of processing the complicated feelings I have about my mother and our relationship. We're cordial now. We see each other at family events, but there's a distance between us that I don't think will ever completely close. Part of me wishes she could acknowledge what she said, apologize, or at least recognize how wrong she was about me. But I've accepted that might never happen, and more importantly, I've realized I don't need it to happen. My peace doesn't depend on her admission of fault. It depends on my knowledge that I proved her wrong through action rather than argument. The penthouse, the business, the life I've built, these aren't just achievements. They're evidence that I was always capable of more than she could see, and that the only person who ever needed to believe in me was me. If there's one message I want you to take from my story, it's this. The people who doubt you, who dismiss your potential, who make you feel small, they don't get to write your story's ending. You do. It doesn't matter if that person is a parent, a partner, a friend, or even that critical voice in your own head that sounds suspiciously like all the people who've ever underestimated you. What matters is that you make a conscious decision to prove them wrong, not for their validation, but for your own peace and self-respect. The revenge isn't in rubbing your success in their faces. It's in building a life so fulfilling that their opinion becomes completely irrelevant to your happiness. My transformation from a struggling retail worker to a successful business owner with a $2 million penthouse wasn't about luck, connections, or some special talent I was born with. It was about discipline, strategy, resilience, and an unshakable commitment to becoming someone I could be proud of. There were countless moments when quitting would have been easier, when going back to a normal job with a steady paycheck would have felt safer, when the voice of doubt almost convinced me to accept mediocrity. But every time I wanted to give up, I remembered standing in that hallway, hearing my mother tell her friend I'd never amount to anything, and that memory became fuel that pushed me forward even when I was exhausted and scared. The most beautiful part of this journey isn't the penthouse or the Mercedes or the successful business. It's the fact that I genuinely love who I've become through the process of building all of it. I'm more confident, more capable, more self-reliant, and more at peace than I ever was when I was desperately seeking approval from people who couldn't see my value. I've learned that you can't control what others think about you, but you have absolute control over what you think about yourself and what you're willing to work for. So to anyone out there who's been told they'll never be successful, never amount to anything, never achieve their dream, please understand that those statements say everything about the person speaking them and absolutely nothing about your actual potential. Your story isn't over until you decide it is, and you have the power to write a completely different ending than anyone expects. So now I want to hear from you. After hearing everything I went through, what would you have done in my place? Would you have confronted your mother immediately after overhearing that conversation, or would you have chosen the path of silent transformation like I did? Do you think proving people wrong through success is the best form of revenge, or is there a better way to handle betrayal from family? I'm genuinely curious about your perspective because everyone's journey and values are different, and I'd love to know how this story resonates with your own experience. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and I love having these real conversations with you all. If you've ever been underestimated, dismissed, or told you weren't good enough by someone who should have supported you, I hope my story shows you that their doubt doesn't have to become your reality. You have so much more power than you realize to change your circumstances, build the life you want, and become someone you're genuinely proud of regardless of who believes in you at the start. It's not easy. God knows these past 4 years have been the hardest of my life, but it's absolutely possible if you're willing to commit to the work and refuse to accept other people's limitations as your own. Your potential isn't defined by anyone's opinion except the one you prove through action. Before you go, make sure you're subscribed to this channel because I share stories like this regularly. Real experiences about overcoming family drama, toxic relationships, workplace betrayals, and personal transformations that'll inspire you to take control of your own narrative. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload. And if this story impacted you in any way, leave a like to help it reach other people who might need to hear it. Next week, I'm sharing another incredible story about someone who turned their biggest heartbreak into their greatest comeback. And trust me, you won't want to miss it. Thank you so much for listening to my story, for being part of this community, and for supporting each other in the comments. It means more than you know. I'll see you in the next video.